All righty, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. If you are here for the CRP webinar, then you're in the right place. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And on behalf of Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, we're excited to get to share this information with you all. So my name is Cassie Roush, and I am the Habitat Partnership Specialist with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever of Illinois. And this evening, we are going to discuss the USDA Conservation Reserve Program, otherwise known as CRP, and the benefits of this program for landowners. We have Farm Bill Biologists Caleb Worley, Ethan Crane, and Trey Thompson presenting tonight, as well as a few of our other biologists in the audience to answer any questions that anyone may have at the end of the presentation. So before we get started, I would like to just remind everyone of a few things. So to avoid excess noise, we will have all participants' microphones and webcams disabled throughout the presentation. If you do have a question for the presenter, you can use the questions and answers or the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send an email with a copy of the PowerPoint and a YouTube link to this recording to all registered participants. So without further ado, again, thank you all, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our Farm Bill biologist, Trey Thompson, to kick things off.
All right. So if you could go to the second slide. In this presentation, we will go over things you should consider up front prior to enrolling, and overviews of general CRP and continuous CRP, as well as their differences and the contract management that is required for both, and also what you should do next. Background on CRP. For those of you who don't know, CRP stands for Conservation Reserve Program, and it has been around since 1985. It's beneficial to soil, water, and wildlife, and it has saved around 8 billion tons of soil in that time. It provides a stable income for farmers and provides funding opportunities that help boost rural economies. And could you move to the next slide, please? Oh, I think we skipped one. Can you go ahead just one more? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. CRP has become very popular, and according to this farmer, they have saved 1,730 metric tons of CO2 per year, the equivalent of driving 2.5 million miles per year. And the CRP and cover crops attract deer and pheasants. So your payment rates are not determined by your chosen CRP practice. It's determined by your top 3 soil types, and your estimated payment rate can be determined when you come into the office. In order to be eligible for CRP enrollment, the land must have cropping history reported to FSA, and it must have been a rotational or grain crops. The producer must have owned or operated the land for at least 12 months prior to the CRP offer. And FSA can provide participants with annual rental payments, as well as cost share assistance. So prior to enrolling, you should start thinking about areas such as this where it would be appropriate to implement a conservation practice. So on average, only 60% of the farm turns to total profit, while 20% breaks even and 20% loses money. That underperforming 20% would be worth enrolling in CRP to reduce future losses. Taking land out of production can actually save you money in the long term. So this section of the field circled here, the areas that are in red and yellow are either breaking even or losing money consistently year after year, regardless of the conditions of the year or the crop that was planted. And so consistently unproductive areas like these would be worth enrolling in a conservation program, again, to save money in the long term. And Caleb and Ethan will go more in depth on precision ag later on in this presentation. This area on the left side of the map in blue laid consistently wet, so wetland CRP practice was established. Taking these acres out of production increased the profitability by $6,400 per year. If they were to put tile in these fields to help with drainage, it could take 3 to 5 years to pay off that work. But by instead putting it into CRP rather than tiling and continuing to farm, they increased their profitability between $19,000 and $32,000 in that time. So prior to sign up, it's important to determine what your goals are, whether they be monetary goals or recreational goals, or a goal to leave a legacy to whoever you pass this land on to. And you should be thinking about what you already have, what you want, how much time and effort you're willing to commit to this, and what's best for your land. So you basically need to figure out where you want to do what. And I'll hand this off to Ethan now. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I will be talking about the new general sign up for CRP that will be beginning here soon. So if you want to go ahead and Caleb, and we can get this started. So as for the sign up for general CRP, it's usually 6 weeks long. When we set this date, we were hoping we were going to know the start date for that, but we have not been told. We're hoping hopefully by the end of the month. When we do get a date, keep an eye out for that, but we're hoping Cassidy can also email everybody the dates for when the sign up closes and starts. The general CRP is a competitive sign up though, so you will basically get an application for your offer for the CRP, and it will be put in a national grouping, and then kind of scored off that. And we'll go a little bit more in depth in that here in a little bit. The contract starts on October 1st and then would expire 10 to 15 years later, whichever contract you length you go with, on September 30th. And there are no incentive payments with general CRP like some of the other CRP programs that we have. And like I said, your general CRP is ranked by the national ranking process, and the EBI is a ranking tool used for that. It is a point score association to basically each CRP offer based on environmental benefits and costs. The score changes every year, what it takes to get accepted, and we are not told that. It is actually decided later on. And then the data is in analyze. Yeah, you're good. The environmental benefits index, the EBI, factors that you can influence on your own, depending on your vegetative cover, and payment rate is your N1 wildlife factor, which is the main one. That one has a few different parts to it. N4, your enduring benefits factor, N5, your air quality benefits, and the N6 cost. And yeah. So your EBI, which for the N1, your wildlife factor, is based off of three things: your A, B, and C component, and you can get a possible from anywhere from 10 to 100 points, depending on what you select. And your wildlife habitat cover, you can see, is 10 to 15 points, depending on practice and how diverse you want your seeding, or possibly if you're planting trees, your trees, how diverse you go with that. For wildlife enhancement, you can either get 0, 5, or 20. And then your N1C is a wildlife priority zone, and you're either going to get 0 or 30 points for this. And this map here on the right shows those priority zones for last year's sign up. We do not currently have a new one, but the blue zones are what the Illinois thinks is a priority zone, and the orange is what nationally they have a priority zone. So if you're in those areas, you automatically get that 30 points. If not, unfortunately, you don't get any. You can't really change that. So for your wildlife habitat cover, this starts to begin kind of what you want to do with your property and what you're looking for. And there's quite a few different practices that are underneath your general sign up for wildlife habitat cover. The first one is a CP1, that's introduced grasses and legumes. And you can either get 10 or 40 points depending on how diverse you go. The 10-point mix is only 3 species of grasses, and the 40-point would be 3 grasses and a legume or forb. That one isn't necessarily best for your wildlife benefits. Those are usually for more of your if you have some really erodible land. Sometimes that introduced grasses holds the ground a little bit better, but it isn't one that is really sought out for your wildlife. The CP2 is your native grasses and legumes, and for this one, depending on your mix that you pick, would be 20 or 50 points. For the 20-point mix, you just have to have 2 grasses and 1 forb, but for the 30 or 50 points would be 3 grasses and 2 forbs. And for that one, it's pretty easy to find a mix to get to 50 points. And that one's going to be a lot of your native prairie, short and tall prairie grasses qualify for that. Big, the little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, side oats, grama. There's quite a few that fall into that. For your tree plantings, there's basically your basic tree plantings is CP3, which consists of a lot of softwoods. Around here, we see a lot more of CP3A hardwood plantings. These we don't necessarily deal with. A forester deals with our tree plantings mainly, but there's a 10, 20, 30, and 50-point option for that. And for the 50-point option for the hardwood tree planting, you just have to have 3 different species of a hardwood tree planted. And sometimes the rates for the softwood tree planting, your trees per acre kind of depends on how many points you will get for that. And then the next 2 are a little bit, you'll get more points for. The CP4D is your permanent wildlife habitat. This practice right here, a lot of the Farm Bill biologists deal with throughout the state. It is, if you are trying to create a habitat for wildlife, this is going to be the program that you want. The CP4Ds can be about as elaborate as you want, or they can be kind of basic. Now for the 4D, the 40-point mix, you have to have just 4 species, a mix of grasses, forbs, and you have to have a woody component. Now on those, we a lot of times suggest planting shrubs, and there's all sorts of different wildlife benefiting shrubs that you can plant. And your local wildlife biologist, if you're interested in that, can help you out with that. For your CP42, that's your basic pollinator habitat, and that one is an automatic 50 points, but you have to have at least 9 pollinating benefit flowers, shrubs, or legumes, and 3 have to be each in your spring, summer, and fall bloom period. So you basically 3 for each blooming period. But with that, the more diverse mix you plant for those, the better off you are when it comes to the pollinator habitat. So for the B part of your wildlife enhancement, you can enhance your CRP by putting in a pollinator habitat plot. Now it has to be less than 10% of your acreage that you're going to put in. So usually they're smaller. And you get an automatic 20 points if you do that. That's another way. If you're doing a 4D, you can bump it up and get a few more points with that. You can also put in a wildlife food plot, which is an automatic 5 points. With your food plots, though, it is a max of 5 acres or 10% of your acreage. So basically, if you're over 50 acres, you can put in 5 acres with a food plot. If you're under, say you have 45, you can do 4.5 acres of food plot. And then right here's an example of a pollinator food plot in full bloom. And the pollinator is also available in continuous CRP, which Caleb will talk about a little bit later. Then here's an example of like 5 points for a food plot. And as I just said, it's limited to 10% or 5 acres of your field. Should be planted every year. You don't necessarily have to plant the same thing every year. You can switch it up. If you want to do a few different food plots and have different food sources, you can also do that, but there is no cost sharing for the seed for your food plot. So the N4 enduring benefits, this is basically on how long the likelihood for the certain CRP practice to remain in place beyond the contract period. You'll get the most points for trees and less points for pollinators. And some CRP practices, you will get no points. Carbon sequestration. This is a chart, as you can see, that is already preset. It could change, but this is the one that we have been given. And as you can see, based on which practice you choose, that's how many points you will get. Your tree practices are going to get more points than some of your grass practices like your CP1 and your CP2. And the food plot is going to get 0, but should be getting points for your other practices for that. EBI, so for your cost. So this formula is, you can determine this a little bit. The cost, the N6A cost is determined after the end of the sign up. So if you have lower acre rental rates, you will probably have more points, therefore have increased chances of being accepted. And one way to do that would be reduced payments based off your rental rate. So once they give you your soil rental rate, if you want to take, you know, a 10% reduced payments to get some more points, you could do that. That's one way a lot of people will do that to make sure they kind of are guaranteed to get their CRP approved. And then here's kind of an example of enhancing your cover type. This is a brome grass field, which would be a CP1 practice that's currently at 10 points. And then if you plant diverse natives like a CP2, CP4D, or for a pollinator, a CP42, you can get up to 15 points. One thing I forgot to mention on the CP4D mixes, a lot of those are the same as your CP2 mixes. The difference with the 4D is that you are required to have the woody component of shrubs and or trees in it. And then here's an example of this field. They didn't have a food plot on their first CRP application. It came up for re-enrollment and they decided to add in a food plot here, which was easy for them, and it got them an extra 5 points on their application. So the recap of general CRP, it's great for if you're going to do a whole field, or if you have a portion of your field that don't qualify for continuous CRP. the general CRP is great for that. Another thing is the more diverse seed mixes / enhancement plots you decide to do, the more benefit you are and the more most likely you are to get in. And 3, kind of think about the goals that you want for your property. You know, are you wanting to make your property more successful for all wildlife, a certain kind of wildlife? You know, kind of start thinking about that. If you want to make appointments to meet in the office, the NRCS, FSA, as Farm Bill Biologists can sit down and go over things with you to help you make the most out of your property. And now I will be handing it off to Caleb Worley.
Right. Thank you, Ethan and Trey. Tonight, I'll be talking about continuous CRP, which under continuous CRP, we're taking environmentally desirable land and devoting it to a certain CRP practice that may be enrolled at any time, as long as the practice is authorized and there are acres available. The big difference between continuous CRP and general CRP is that in continuous CRP, the offers are not subject to competitive bidding. So again, as long as there are acres there and a sign up available, you will automatically be eligible for continuous CRP and you'll get in. Again, continuous CRP is looking at practices that are specific to addressing a resource concern, whether that is soil, water, or wildlife habitat. The sign up is continuously going on. There are some incentive payments that are offered through continuous CRP that aren't available through general CRP, which may increase your soil rental rate. Another incentive payment is the practice incentive payment, which is on top of your 50% cost share. So essentially, to establish habitat on your property, you get 50% cost share, and the other 50% is covered through a practice incentive payment, essentially covering all costs to establish the habitat. Contracts are 10 to 15 years, depending on the practice. Here are just a few examples of continuous CRP practices. They all have that same CP9 code that our general practices have. I do include the name for each practice so that you're not confused by the numbers. Again, we're looking at taking environmentally sensitive land out of production. So things like wetland restoration, wildlife habitat buffers, filter strips along streams or creeks, or other wildlife habitat plantings. Start with CP9, which is a shallow water area for wildlife. These have to be less than 10 acres in size, 10 acres or less. You're looking at adding a 20 to 120 foot grass buffer around your wet area. And it is a shallow water area, so you're only looking at a depth of 6 to 18 inches. This practice does require some engineered dirt work. So maybe making some dugouts to hold some water, possibly putting in levees and water control structures. CP21 is a grass vegetative filter strip. It's pretty common, very common CRP practice. For this practice, you're looking at a minimum of 20 feet to a maximum of 120 feet wide. The purpose of a grass filter strip is to remove nutrients, sediment, organic matter, pesticides, and other pollutants from your water source, whether that's through surface water runoff or subsurface flow. Not only are they environmentally beneficial for your water quality, but they're also great wildlife habitat, especially when they're planted to native grasses and wildflowers. Going back to the widths, that's kind of determined on how steep your slopes are going into that water source. The steeper the slopes, the wider your filter strip is going to have to be. Here's an example of a ditch that was eligible for a filter strip. You can see there on heavy rainfall events that that ditch floods out and it's affecting the crops that are planted there. This is just a tract map of that area. You can see even on this map, those areas where those crops aren't doing so great. So by establishing a 120-foot filter strip on both sides of that ditch, we were able to pretty much cover most of those areas where the crops were not doing so great. Here is a picture of what a filter strip would look like out on the land. You can see there that there are a lot of wildflowers in there, as well as native warm season grasses. And those native warm season grasses are not only providing wildlife habitat, but they're also filtering the sediment and excess nutrients from entering that water source. Also, those areas that were previously being cropped are now in the CRP program. And essentially you're increasing the yield on your farm as you're receiving a CRP payment on those acres, and you're not losing money by farming those acres. CP 23A is a wetland restoration practice, and this is in for non-floodplain areas. For all of the wetland practices, you have to have at least 50% hydric soils in your offered area, and we can determine that for you. But I do get asked very often what a hydric soil is. And a hydric soil is just a soil that's formed under conditions of saturation, flooding, or ponding, which causes anaerobic conditions in your soil, which means your soil doesn't have any oxygen in it. Again, we can determine what types of soils you have on your property. One thing with the non-floodplain wetland restoration is you can have up to a 4-to-1 ratio of upland habitat versus your wetland. This wetland practice does not require earth moving. In my area, we do a lot of vegetative wetlands where we're putting down a wet seed mix in your wet areas. And then your upland buffer, we're putting down a drier type mix. You can have food plots as well as tree and shrub plantings in the non-floodplain wetlands. Here's just the aerial image of some areas that are where frequent ponding is occurring. These would be great areas to put in a wetland CRP practice. Here's just a tract map. You can see in that northeast corner, there is a lot of ponding going on, and there's going to be pretty low yields in that area. So putting that into CRP, you could take about 3.8 acres and put that with your wet mix. That's going to be areas that are actually holding water. And then you can put a 4-to-1 ratio of upland buffer around those wet areas. You're also going to square off your field doing that, which is going to make ease of farming better. CP23 is just a wetland restoration program that is in the 100-year floodplain. The only difference between the non-floodplain wetland is that this one is in a floodplain, and you can only have a 3-to-1 ratio of upland habitat versus wetland habitat. Again, we can determine your soil type and can also determine whether your property is located in the 100-year floodplain or not. And again, food plots as well as tree and shrub plantings are allowed. Here is an example of a field that was enrolled into the floodplain practice. Floodplain wetland practice. You can see there along the tree line where that original creek or stream flows, and then after flooding events, it starts to form some oxbows, and there were also some dugouts created to hold water. Looking at a tract map now, there is a stream or river to the southwest corner of that map there across the road. And when flooding occurs, it's going up into the agriculture field. You can see some areas where there's higher elevation, areas that might not get flooded out. And those are areas where we could establish the upland buffer. So looking at that example, there are about 10 acres that would be planted to your wetland mix, and then a little over 9 acres that would be planted to your upland buffer. Again, squaring off that field, not following the contour line of the wetland, just to make farming easy. CP33 is a habitat buffer for upland birds. With this practice, you're looking at a 30 to 120 foot average width along one or all sides of your crop field. One caveat to this is that it must border cropland, and that can include pivot corners. Fields must be at least 5 acres in size, and seed costs can range from around $80 to $150 per acre. Like wet years, when we're typically looking at putting things into wetlands, we also have dry years, and you're going to see a lot of that along your tree lines. Your trees are going to be shading out your crops and taking in water and nutrients that should be going to your crops. These are perfect places where you could be putting in an upland buffer. This was a study done out of Mississippi State University, and it was done in Illinois and some surrounding states, looking at CP33 buffers and how that affects bobwhite quail populations. They found that breeding season bobwhite densities were more than 70% greater on CP33 fields than control fields. They also found that fall bobwhite covey densities were 50%, 70%, and 110% greater on CP33 fields than control fields. Here's another study done by Iowa State University, IDNR, Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and Pheasants Forever. They were looking at CP33s and how that affects pheasant populations. They found that pheasants select landscapes with a mix of cropland and grassland cover types, with waste grain used as a primary food source and herbaceous cover used to raise young and avoid predators. They also found that pheasant densities increased in a mixed cropland grassland landscape as the proportion of grassland increases to a maximum of approximately 30 to 50%, with the cropland making up most of the remainder. In my opinion, if managed correctly, the CP33s are one of the most important wildlife CRP practices we have. You're combining habitat cover with a food source right next to each other. All of your pheasant, quail, turkey chicks, they're all using that cover in the spring to raise their young. And then in the winter, they're feeding off waste grain that might be surrounding your crop field. CP42 is pollinator practice, and these are great for small fields, odd areas, and it also is upland wildlife habitat. With this practice, your field has to be a minimum of half an acre, and the contract acres cannot exceed 10 acres or 10% of the cropland acres, whichever is less. So if you only have 50 acres that you're farming on your farm, then you could only put in a 5-acre pollinator plot. The seed cost is a little bit more for this type of practice, but the cost share recognizes that and provides you a little bit more money for this type of practice. Just to note, pollinator habitat is upland habitat and benefits all types of wildlife, including deer, turkey, pheasants, quail, and non-game birds. Having a diverse mix of native grasses and native forbs is going to bring in a whole lot of different types of insects, and your turkey, quail, and pheasant chicks are all going to be feeding on those insects during the beginning stages of their life, as those insects have a high amount of protein. CP43 are prairie strips. This is a relatively new practice, and they have to be 30 to 120 feet wide. They cannot exceed 25% of your cropland area, and they differ from your field borders because they can be placed through a field, parallel or perpendicular to a grassed waterway, or they could surround your crop field. This was a study done by Iowa State University, and they found that putting 10% of the farm into prairie strips reduced soil loss by 95%, nitrates by 72%, phosphorus by 77%, and total nitrogen by 70%. Just a 10% reduction in field size to be placed into prairie strips can lead to a 5 to 30% yield increase in soybeans, and a 40% yield increase was achieved after interseeding the prairie strips with buckwheat. This is an example of a prairie strip here in central Illinois, and these photos were taken early to midsummer. And having these prairie strips in this crop field actually caught 8 inches of soil after a heavy rainfall. Similarly, in a soybean field, it increased the yield from 50 to 20%, or 5 to 20%. So I do talk about increasing yield a lot with continuous CRP. So by using continuous CRP, we can increase the bottom line on your farm through what's called precision agriculture. Typically, we're looking at wet areas, areas near tree lines, saline or compact soils, or odd and small areas that are hard to farm. The saying here is turning our red acres green. So you can see here, the red acres are areas where the profit does not exceed the cost to put into farming. Your yellow or orange areas are usually areas that are breaking even, and your green areas are areas where you're profiting. Establishing a CP33 field border on 2 parts of this farm along the tree line increased the return on investment by 10.6%. So profit was around $137 an acre prior to establishing field borders, which increased the profit to around $151 per acre. This example, we had a non-floodplain wetland restoration done. You can see those red areas there on the left map, where those areas were laying wet constantly and harvest was always low. Taking those areas out of production and adding an upland buffer increased the return on investment by 4.6%, increasing profit from $84 an acre to $107 an acre. A lot of farms have odd areas. Those can often be difficult to access. You might have overlapping rows. They might be less productive and oftentimes may have wildlife damage. I see a few areas just on this map where it might be hard to get in there. There might be some competition with trees. And again, oftentimes those are areas where wildlife are going to be hitting your crops. By putting those odd areas into a CRP practice, you're squaring off your fields. It's easier to access, especially with the growing size of farming equipment nowadays. Sometimes those smaller areas can be a hassle to get into. Squaring up fields. So we are trying to make farming easier, but we're also wanting to get wildlife habitat on the ground. Squaring up fields can reduce your fuel consumption. You'll have less wear and tear on equipment, spend less time in the field, and make fewer turns. On this example, I'm specifically looking at the northeast and southeast corners of these fields. You don't have a straight line. Some of those areas are small. And if you're farming from north to south, you might have difficulty planting straight rows in those areas. By squaring off those fields with the CRP practice, we're making farming easier. You're going to make less turns, and you might be putting less wear and tear on your equipment. I saved SAFE for the end. SAFE stands for State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement. It is a continuous CRP practice, and new to this year, it's available in every county and township in Illinois, where in the past, only select townships were eligible for this practice. There's a pheasant safe initiative, as well as a quail safe initiative. And on the map, you can see what county those lie in. There are some requirements for SAFE, one being that you must have a minimum of 10 acres. If enrolling multiple fields, total acres must add up to a minimum of 10 acres and must be touching. There are some restrictions, specifically with quail safe, only native short grasses are authorized or allowed. So no big blue stem, Indian grass, or switchgrass. There's a management practice that is required 1 out of every 4 years, and wind turbines are not authorized on safe acres. Some practices that are eligible through SAFE include our native buffers, things like our field borders and prairie strips, wetlands, the shallow water area for wildlife, which is not eligible for quail safe, as well as non-floodplain wetlands. There are also hold field practices such as native grass plantings, wildlife habitat plantings, and rare and declining habitat. And food plots may be used in conjunction with safe practices, but only with your native grass planting and wildlife habitat planting. Management or mid-contract management is a requirement for most CRP practices, and that is usually completed in years 4 through 6 for 10-year contracts. Typically, it's completed over a 3-year period where we're splitting the contract acres into thirds. Especially if we're working with larger fields, we don't want to disturb all of that habitat in 1 year. There is no cost share offered for mid-contract management activities. If you do recall, I talked about a practice incentive payment for continuous practices. 10% of that payment is paid in year 5 to help out with your mid-contract management activity. Common mid-contract management activities in Illinois include prescribed fire, interseeding, strip disking, strip spraying, and prescribed grazing. With prescribed fire, you must have an IEPA open burn permit, as well as a burn plan on file, in which a Farm Bill biologist can assist you with that process. With interseeding, we're more than likely looking at putting more forbs or wildflowers out on the field. And oftentimes there is some site prep required prior to interseeding. Strip disking, we're just looking at a light disking to expose some bare ground and to encourage more forb growth. Strip spraying is usually a grass selective herbicide, and we're looking at thinning thick native grass stands to encourage more forb growth. And then prescribed grazing, which isn't done very commonly, but is a very beneficial tool when managing native grasslands. With that, you would need something to graze your CRP acres, and you would also need to have some type of permanent or temporary fencing. So just to summarize, if you're trying to decide whether you should go with continuous or general CRP, with continuous, if you have hydric soils, that's definitely the route to go. Or if you just want to put in a buffer or filter strip, if you have a whole field that's over 10 acres, or maybe you just want to put in a small pollinator plot, then continuous is for you. If you're thinking about general CRP, it's best to be located in one of the conservation priority areas. Maybe you don't have hydric soils, or you have a field that's under 10 acres and it's highly erodible land. Then general CRP might be the way to go for you. So again, weigh out your options and be mindful of the future. We're here to help. So contact a PF or QF biologist to schedule a site visit or ask for advice. If you're new to CRP and you don't have a farm or tract number established, bring a deed and a map in when visiting the Farm Service Agency, and make sure to check cropping history on your farm so that we know that you're eligible for CRP. Remember, we're here to help. I'd just like to give a shout out to all of our partnering agencies, because without them, there wouldn't be CRP, and there might not even be Pheasants Forever Farm Bill Biologists. Our partners include, but are not limited to, the Farm Service Agency, Natural Resources Conservation Services, United States Department of Agriculture, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Before I turn it over for questions, I did want to include our current coverage area. All of those areas highlighted currently as a Farm Bill biologist. We are currently growing and expanding into the West Central location, where we will have a Farm Bill biologist based out of Virginia, Illinois, covering Cass, Fulton, Mason, Scott, Pike, and Morgan counties. We'll also have a biologist out of Macomb, Illinois, covering McDonough, Schuyler, Hancock, Brown, and Adams counties. I do have 2 QR codes there. The first one will take you to the Illinois site, where you can find contact information and coverage area for all of the Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever staff in the state of Illinois. The second is the national site. It'll take you to the Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever national site that shows all of the Farm Bill biologists located in the US, along with their coverage area and contact information. This time, I'll turn it over for questions.
All righty, thank you to our Farm Bill Biologists for all that information this evening. As Caleb said, we've got some time here this evening. We kind of have time allotted until 8 o'clock. Again, we don't want to keep you guys too long, but please, if you have any questions, anything that didn't get covered, anything you want to go over again and just get cleared up, please go ahead and put those questions into the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll go ahead and get those answered for you. All right. We've got a couple coming in here. So Dean asks, can you use big blue stem with a windbreak tree planting? Any of our biologists can answer that one for us. You guys can go ahead and hop on. You're welcome to use your mics too, if you guys want to do that.
Yeah, for a windbreak planting, you can use, since that's going to be primarily a tree practice, it won't specify what will be used as cover underneath them. As long as they're within so far of the tree, I believe you can use whatever cover seed you would like. I don't believe it doesn't necessarily have to be anything native. It can be cool season as well.
All right, thank you, Brody. Barb asked, why is crop history a requirement for wildlife and pollinators programs?
I guess the crop history would be a requirement for CRP because you're getting paid, so it's kind of to make up for having crops, and they're paying you to cover some of that cost, but it is not a requirement for other wildlife and pollinator programs. There's other programs out there that can help cost share to establish habitat or help you enhance it, if that helps.
Yeah, and it looks like Caleb was typing an answer to that question. But yeah, just to reiterate what Ethan said, CRP, or the Conservation Reserve Program, is targeting cropland acres and taking those acres out of production. So any CRP practice does require the cropping history.
I know her Boone County.
Do any of our biologists know where Boone County is at?
Yes, Jared Tricky covers that area. I believe he is in the chat as well. Let's see. Jared Tricky is out of the Rockford office and does cover Boone County as well. We'll drop his info in the chat.
Yes, Andrew. The question was, will this video be offered at a later date? This video is recorded and it will be sent to all of the participants once it's over with.
Alrighty, everyone. I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap things up. I do want to encourage you all, if you have any other questions, anything comes up after this, go ahead and reach out to your nearest Farm Bill biologist. You can find them on our Illinois website with that QR code there, or it is www.ihuntil.com. So thank you all so much again, and keep your eye out for this recording. We'll be sending it to all of our registrants this evening. So have a wonderful evening, everyone.